Hey, it's Melissa at Twin Oaks Farm in rural Southeast Ohio, USA, and it's Broilers Day 40. We're headed into the barn, and so we'll get a look, and then I'll give you an explanation what's going on. On Broilers Day 39, I told y'all we would try to get some recording of feeding the broilers in the morning. And so here is a flock of 296 Cornish rock cross meat chickens. The barn is still darkened because this is actually start of day for them, and they've come over here because this is where they know we get the feed from. So one of the things in our management is that we don't like to let feeders go empty, and this is why. Because if they go without food when they're at this stage of growth, which is basically finished, they become so hungry that it's like a mob when they recognize that the food's coming. The lighting will improve shortly. We'll get an overhead light on, but we're actually putting feed into their feeders while the barn is still darkened, because we utilize the the natural nightfall overnight to make a block of time where we don't have feed in the pen and in the feeders. And you'll have to watch some of the other broilers videos to get some background on that. But management wise, for our flocks, and remember, we are raising these meat chickens specifically to be processed into poultry, and we are aiming for having them go from the day they're hatched to the day they're processed in 42 days. It just so happens this flock has a 45-day production schedule, and that's a little longer than we prefer. And it also just so happened that this flock basically was ahead of schedule on their growth and was really considered finished and ready at about day 35 to 37, 38. So we actually now have birds that really are finished production, ready to be slaughtered and processed into poultry, and we need to keep them thriving until what will be their day 45, which, as I said, this is day 40, so about 5 more days. So coupled with that, we have a target feed consumption range as a big picture, an overall picture for the flock and for raising the flock. So we know from the beginning, when we move these birds in, the day that they're hatched, we knew that as a flock of 300, that we would expect them to consume about 3,000 pounds over the 42 days, ideally. So we'll get back to that train of thought. So kind of talk again about what is, pardon me, Jared, sorry. Jared's helping get the feed in because you can see he's doing it on his own, but it is a lot for one person. And he's very calm and very methodical when it comes to that kind of high pressure situation of dealing with the intensity of the birds, because you can see they're really jockeying for position. So and it's also good, like having multiple flock managers, multiple flock handlers. Chickens can distinguish up to about 100 faces, including humans and animals. So they do recognize the people that they see regularly over time. But of course, you know, they see me more than they see the other members of my household. So, you know, when I would go in there, it's a different reaction than, say, when someone else in our household goes in there. So this is another feeder that we have. That's really my favorite feeder. I don't know how Jared feels about it, but that's my favorite feeder. So you'll kind of see the difference, how they line up around that. And that feeder actually accommodates a few more grown chickens than these rounded feeders. But I mean, even here, you can see how they're jockeying for position. And so one of the things I said in the beginning is we're actually doing a couple of things here that we don't prefer to do in our management practices. And one of them is to let the feeders go totally empty. We don't like to let the feeders go totally empty because it produces this mob mentality frenzy. We don't remove feeders, and that's what a lot of poultry producers that are raising smaller flocks than this are recommended to do. They're told to do a 12 hours on, 12 hours off feed schedule and take feeders away from the birds in a 12-hour block of time So they do, and then in the morning when they have to feed, it produces this frenzy. But we're like this feeder, we're going to get more feed in this, but they're flocking around it to the point that they're shoving it off of its base, you know. So so a couple other things here on their behavior. So I was telling you the two things we don't like to do. We don't like to let feeders go empty because we refuse to remove feeders, and letting them go empty is similar to removing them. By not removing them, it saves us the hassle of having to wade through that mob and place the feeder back on its base, but letting it go empty still produces the mob mentality. The other thing that I said we don't like to do, or have said we don't like to do, is the 12 hours on, 12 hours off, but we are in essence doing that because we adjusted our typical management procedure. We usually leave lighting, overhead lighting that is bright, that more or less mimics daylight. We usually leave that on overnight. So our flocks in meat production have overhead light generally 24/7 start to finish in production. And we've altered that with this flock because you can use lighting level to impact flock behavior, and we needed to hold back their feeding time. And one way we could do it was to get them a block of time where they're inactive, and chickens are inactive when it's totally dark, like overnight. So by turning off the overhead light, letting natural nightfall affect their behavior and activity level, they aren't busy overnight. So what we've done is we've had the overhead light off, and the camera does struggle to handle the strong change in light, so please bear with us. But we've had the overhead light off overnight. We've come into the barn while it's still darkened, because just getting their feed alone we knew was enough to really get the birds ready to go and bring on that kind of mentality, that mob mentality frenzy. So we put the feed down first. Now we're going to open up at least 2 or 3 sets of the barn doors on the sides, and they're big, as you can see, they're big carriage doors that let a lot of natural light stream in. As that happens, more natural light's going to stream in from all sides, and we're going to see even more activity. I don't know how we'd see more activity across the pen, but we'll see even more activity across the pen. So as I said, we are doing those two things. We refuse to remove feeders, but letting them go totally empty for an extended period of time is essentially the same thing. We don't like to do that as a general management practice, but we are doing that. And we are utilizing a darkened period overnight to basically create a 12-hour on, 12-hour off feed schedule. So those are two things that we prefer, our own preferences, that we prefer not to do, but they were two things that this flock needed in order to keep them at the target feed range. And so that's what I was talking about early when I said, see, there's that longer feeder, which isn't that long, right there at my husband's feet, where he's opening up that door. But more birds really fit around that longer feeder than around these. And so as the first birds that made it to the feeders eat, and they'll move away from the feeders, then the other birds that were trying to jockey to get in will continue to get to the feeders, and they'll get to eat. And we'll gradually, as we observe the birds, we'll gradually see, I talked about in Broilers Day 39, how we do visually observe for the crop of the bird filling, and that's basically on the bird's right side, the right side of the bird's more or less chicken breast area. After they've eaten, we see a bulge, and that's where one of their organs, the crop, has filled in with food. And incidentally, that's one of the reasons you make sure to do a feed withdrawal at the end of production, and you withhold feed like even 12 to 18 hours from meat chickens before you slaughter them and process them, because if that crop is full, when you slaughter them, there's a tendency for that to be busted or burst, and it makes a job that you're trying to keep as hygienic as possible become messy. So that's why we do the feed withdrawal, so that the crop is empty and the digestive system is empty when the bird is processed. So at any rate, when I was talking about the target feed consumption range, that's the thing I was in the beginning of the video talking about. We know that for 300 birds, which this flock started out 305, we've had some random flock losses. We're at 296. And we know from the beginning that they should consume about 3,000 pounds of feed to finish. And that is because you can finish a meat chicken per chicken, on average, 10 pounds of feed per bird. So we figure up 3,000 pounds. We give them free feed, as much as they want, as in free choice, the first week of life. And then the second week of life, we still give them basically as much as they want, but generally their appetite increases from the first week to the second week. And so then we watch the feed consumption rate there. Then there's typically one more jump in appetite. And when that second jump in appetite happens, we just figure out some math formulas in our head, like ratios and proportions, and we look at how many pounds of feed do we have left, how many days do we have left, and we split up the pounds of feed according to the days left. And that's how we figure out, like, for example, with this flock, 100 pounds a day is their allotment. So we don't want to overfeed meat birds, because that can contribute to heart problems and leg problems. And we'll go over to these two birds as we're finishing up here. We are going to be wrapping it up, but we wanted y'all to see the flock's reaction at large when they've had to go an extended amount of time and they're this far along in production, where they're basically ready to process. And here's a good example on this rooster. Looking at it, it'll look like your left, but it's his right side. The crop is full, so he's been to the feeder, eating his fill, and then, you know, his body will work on digesting that, and later on he'll go back to the feeder. So that's how they roll. But we wanted you to see their reaction, their strong reaction to that feed. And then we've got these two over here. I mentioned that overfeeding itself can lead to leg problems and heart problems. Now, these birds weren't overfed, but we had these two birds, so this was kind of random, you know, in the flock, that these two had leg problems. Now, we separated them. They were in the flock at large, and we separated them out of the flock and moved them over here. And there was actually a third one that had come over here with them that was a heart failure. That one ended up dying of natural consequences of heart distress. These two, I did not have high hopes for. This one, on about day 35, just all of a sudden he couldn't walk anymore. And so it was kind of like the way sometimes young people grow so fast that, like, they become a little bit out of balance and a little bit awkward as they kind of get used to their new height or their new build, or, you know, however their growth spurt happened. So it's kind of like that with some of these birds, and that's what it was like with him. He couldn't get his legs underneath him, so was hoping they might get up and go to feed here and water. And show you that now, when we moved him over here, like Broilers day 35, he couldn't even stand up. He couldn't get his legs underneath him and his weight over top his legs, and he couldn't walk. He can walk now. Same with this little hen. She actually still limps. She has one leg that she doesn't use at all, and the other leg that she bears all her weight on. But she is also doing much better than she was when we pulled her out. Had they been left at the flock at large and, like, had to navigate that hysteria when they wanted feed in the morning, those two birds with compromised legs, they would probably get trampled and hurt worse. So that's why we take them out. So now that feed's in, that's quite an ordeal when they're hungry. We'll clean water trays, top off water, make sure it's all full. Water consumption, they're drinking about 60 gallons of water a day. 296 birds. Feed, wanted to also add at some point, we started out on 22% protein. We have switched them to 19% protein. Really just in the last about 3 days, I'd say. Probably about 4 days prior to that, we were splitting it, half 22% protein, half 19% protein. So we gradually bring the protein down a little bit from 22% to 19%, and we will, at the very end, actually we only have one more day of 19%, and then we will feed just cracked corn. So probably in Broilers day 41, we'll give a little discussion about why we go off of the commercially prepared complete feed and opt, just as personal preference here, to finish them on a single ingredient cracked corn feed for just the last couple of days. And then actually the day before the very last day, there's feed withdrawal, where we do take feeders out of the pen because it's time to make sure that their crop is empty and their digestive system is cleaned out before processing. So that's what's going down in the meat bird pen. We hope that y'all have a fantastic week. Their day 40 is fallen on a Sunday, so we recorded on Sunday to show you their actual day 40, but we upload it on the following Monday, and then we'll have a separate video for Monday as well for day 41. So thanks for joining us in the meat bird production barn at Twin Oaks Farm Poultry. This is how chicken is produced, and we're so happy that you'll join us to get a look at one way that it can successfully be done.